So we've all heard the idiom, the end justifies the means. But in this episode, I want to look, kind of do a little switcheroo and take a look from the other direction. Consider whether, for some people, focusing on the outcome, focusing on the end as the be-all and end-all of action can actually make for a sometimes and somewhat dissatisfying and occasionally alienating approach to living life.
We're about to witness the greatest miracle of the machine age.
The Gentle Rebel Podcast.
I'm so glad you could come. This is going to be such an exciting day. I hope you enjoy it. I think you will.
Hey there, welcome to the Gentle Rebel Podcast. Andy Mort here, and we are once again exploring the intersection of high sensitivity, creativity, the culture that we swim in, and, you know, the tides that we sometimes have to swim against as gentle rebels in this weird and wonderful world. I did a quick search on Google for this idea, for the means justifying the end. And Google's AI overview quickly put me right. It was like, the means justifies the end is not a common phrase. The correct saying is the end justifies the means, meaning that if the goal or the end is important enough, then any method used to achieve it, even if morally questionable, can be justified. This is often associated with the political philosopher Machiavelli, although the concept is older than his writings. So there you go. I felt kind of told off by Google there, but I'm going to stick to my guns and say that this is the correct saying for the episode that I have intended to share with you today. So the means justifies the end. I'm going to, lift that phrase out of the context of political ideology. I'm not going to explore it from that perspective, sort of put it in a context of our relationship with things like personal ambition and creativity and that kind of stuff. And so, the reason that this is on my mind this week, or kind of today in particular, is because I've just emerged from a rabbit hole that I have spent the past week or so, maybe 8 days, hanging out in. I'm pretty exhausted, but I wanted to create this while it's all fresh in my mind as well. I talked in the previous episode about this unexpected video that came together when I found myself researching and producing or collecting clips for a video about the self-help influencer Mel Robbins and the questionable details in the story that she's told about how and where she discovered the idea for her latest book, The Let Them Theory. And I could feel myself. I came across this post on Threads at the weekend or the weekend before last, and saw this person posting to the Substack article by Sage Justice and this timeline about Mel Robbins' involvement in this Let Them movement, and I could just feel myself going off the deep end. And I mentioned it in one of our Haven meetings. So on the Sunday night, I talked about it, and just to see if anybody else had heard about this. After I finished that call, I sort of got a bit swept up in it, and thought, I really want to, I'm interested to confirm whether or not these allegations that Mel Robbins has appropriated or plagiarized this idea from the movement that pre-existed her book and her knowledge of the theory that came from a poem by Cassie Phillips. I want to see if there's validity in these claims, and so I fell down the rabbit hole. And if you want to hear more, then do go and listen to the previous episode of the podcast. But it's a funny thing when I can feel myself going off the deep end in this way, and I know it's happening. It's almost like a slow motion thing, and I can feel it stirring inside me, and I can hear my logical brain noticing what's going on. The rational side of my brain is like, Andy, no, you don't have time for this right now. Stop. Think about what you're doing, Andy. What are you doing? Close that web page now. Put your phone away. Oh, okay. Yeah, I can see. You're not going to listen to me. I'll make myself scarce. See you in a week or so. Let me know when you want me back. Don't forget to eat. Bye. That's happened to me many times over the years in very different projects and pieces of work that I've done unexpectedly, things that have come from nowhere. And it can be a wonderful thing because it leads to all sorts of unexpected and interesting creative projects that I look back on afterwards and think, that's quite cool, actually. I'm glad I put the time and energy into that. And I experience this sort of nagging feeling inside me as I'm in those rabbit holes, this judgment, this critical voice saying, you might be wasting your time here. You're getting pulled in a million directions, and this is yet another distraction that bears no relation to what you should be doing. You should be doing all of these other things, and yet you're doing this. But over recent times, I've noticed a kind of shift in my relationship with these moments. I want to say probably the last 2 or 3 years, especially, where I've, I guess, more intentionally noticed the connection, asking myself certain questions about my relationship with these moments so that they aren't just kind of a disparate or irrelevant distraction. And this is partly a mindset thing, and I guess my relationship with the subject or area of the rabbit hole. But it's also the approach or the spirit that I take with me, sort of intentionally take with me into the rabbit hole itself. This is where I was thinking about that switcheroo phrase, the means justifies the end. I don't know where this might end up, but I do know it will be fine because of how I'm choosing to get there. And so the means justifies the end because I'm trusting my instincts. I'm trusting that my intuition is taking me in a direction that is meaningful and purposeful. So, whereas like if the end justifies the means, any course of action is deemed acceptable because the outcome is more important than how that outcome is achieved. This idea of the means justifying the end says the end itself is going to be a reflection of the journey that led to it. The end, as you see it, is a reflection of a set of values or an approach that has been chosen. So how it's done matters more than where you get to, I think. And this reminds me of what we've explored before in the research of the economist David Gallinson, which I first heard about through my friend Kendra Patterson when she did a podcast episode about late bloomers. And she talked about this distinction in creativity between conceptual and experimental approaches to creativity. And there's an article called Experimental Writers versus Conceptual Writers by William Landay, who cites David Gallinson. And the article says, economist David Gallinson posits that there are two types of writers: experimenters, a group that includes Dickens, Twain, and Virginia Woolf, and visionaries, such as Melville, Fitzgerald, and Hemingway. Experimental innovators are seekers. Their most basic characteristic is persistent uncertainty about their methods and goals. They are typically dissatisfied with their current work, but have only vague ideas about how to improve it. Their dissatisfaction impels them to experiment, and their uncertainty means that they change their work by trial and error, moving tentatively toward their imperfectly perceived objectives. No matter how great their progress, their uncertainty rarely allows them to consider any of their works a complete success. In contrast, conceptual innovators are finders. Their basic characteristic is certainty about some aspect of their work, their method, their goals, or both. Their certainty often allows them to work methodically according to some system towards their goals. Their clarity of intent and confidence in their ability often allow them to feel that they have fully realized their objectives in a particular work. I found this a really interesting and insightful distinction. Hearing about it, it was at the end of 2020 when I first heard Kendra talk about it. And this really sparked something for me. It kind of helped many things make sense as I recognized myself in these descriptions of experimental creativity. I think maybe the dissatisfaction of the work is maybe not how I would put it, but like this sense that, okay, you're constantly moving forward and iterating within it and finding all these really interesting little rabbit warrens to explore, and you find new things constantly. And so the concepts evolve rather than, deciding, okay, this is what I want to create and this is exactly where I want it to go. And when I have that, I'll know it's a success. It's like, actually, the success it's more of a feeling that comes through the evolution of the thing itself. So I recognized myself in these descriptions, both in my experience, how projects never become what I expect them to be, and also my preferences. I feel liberated by that sort of experience, that sort of journey in creative projects, whereas I feel trapped by things like SMART goals and conceptual outcomes that demand a fixed and focused course of action in order to reach this exact preconceived destination. Having spoken to a lot of people after sort of hearing about this and exploring these ideas, it sounds like there's a lot of people who share this. And it was at this time that I created the Return to Serenity Island, which really became a way of creatively processing this discovery and reshaping my relationship with the idea of goal setting and personal growth beyond this paradigm of, conceptual vision setting, starting with the end in mind, which had really been drummed into me on the coaching training course that I did, and is, a core part of many coaching approaches, this idea that start with the end in mind. This Stephen Covey from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, you need to know exactly where you want to end up, set stepping stone goals or journey goals to get there, and then take consistent action to reach those goals. Otherwise, you're going to drift. Your life will just sort of be flaky, and you'll waste time and waste your life and fail and all of this stuff. So it was nice to know that, while this is obviously a helpful paradigm for a lot of people, this conceptual approach is the way that many people approach life. It's not a universally applicable one. And the idea that there are others who grow and develop and succeed more inductively rather than deductively is really liberating and really encouraging. This inductive versus deductive, in other words, experimental people connect dots forwards as they go. They don't have this exact image of where they're trying to get to, but the thing comes out of the journey itself, and end up in places that you'd never be able to conceptualize at the start, which again has been my experience over and over with all sorts of things. I often reach these points that are either natural endpoints of projects and pieces of work, or like they're complete moments, or complete enough moments probably. And I think I would never have dreamed that this is where I would get to, or that the project would take this shape. And likewise, if I was able to show, my past self when I'm just starting out on a project, if I was to show him, this is what you're going to create, I'd be like, how? Like, how do I even start working towards that? On the same coin, if I'd stuck with the idea that I did have the thing that did get me started in the first place, because there is always a vision, I suppose, like an idea of, this is what I am creating, whether it's a particular song or a piece of music or a podcast episode or whatever it is, or the Return to Serenity Island. You start like, I'm making this thing. This is the form that I'm creating. But if I'd stuck with that and tethered myself to that idea and said, no, it has to look exactly like that at the end, otherwise I've failed, it would have missed so much of the potential that is lurking within it. And yeah, I guess one major challenge for experimental types is the world definitely leans in the more conceptual direction. And so embodying an experimental approach to life can be hard. And it makes sense, conceptual with a conceptual approach, it's easier to measure things. It's easier to have a much more categorical sense of whether something works or not, whether something has been successful or failed. And so, yeah, like it makes sense that is the way that the world is kind of more oriented towards. But yeah, it's hard, especially if the people around us don't recognize our natural preferences and inclinations, especially if we don't recognize them. If we're trying to fit ourselves into this conceptual way of being, and yet, you might be someone who, I go to work and they're constantly trying to make me come up with smart goals, or people are telling me that I have to begin with the end in mind and have this real vision for my future, but that just doesn't spark anything for me. In fact, it feels like a trap. It feels I feel smaller as a result of trying to fit myself into that kind of way of thinking. And yeah, it can, if you allow yourself to be experimental and to let that experimental spirit flow, it can appear like a lack of coherence to some of our endeavors. It might feel like we're spreading ourselves in too many directions that don't make any sense. Why are you over there and over there? You need to settle on the one true path or whatever. And again, that's a concept that really doesn't fit a lot of experimental people, because actually, if we were to have a true path, if we were to say, okay, let's define the true path of an experimental person, it would go all over the place. It would go in circles. It would drift off over to the right and then come back and cross the central path. And, it's not about getting to B from A. We might go to F before we find our way to B. And if we do get to B, we might have approached it from the back of it and we go on our way to P. I don't know. It's not this sort of linear trajectory of growth. It's not this linear trajectory towards this preconceived idea that is at the end of this path of action. And as Gallinson goes on to say, the life cycles of experimental and conceptual writers tend to differ sharply. Experimental writers' achievements usually depend on gradual improvements in their understanding of their subjects and in their mastery of their craft. Their major contributions consequently emerge only after many years of writing, often late in their careers. Conceptual innovations, which depend on the formulation of new ideas, are made more quickly and typically occur early in a writer's career. So again, this is really interesting. And I really like the idea of this word contribution feels really good. It feels better to me than success or achievement or whatever. What experimental types bring to the world feels nicely captured by this idea, a contribution that this approach brings to the world, because you're pulling things from different places, you're connecting dots. And I think in this sense, it's really helpful to think of progress and think of growth and mastery, if you want to use that word. That's a word that Gallinson used, I think. Thinking of it in terms of seasons and cycles. It's like loops and circles and spirals, rather than, as I say, this sort of linear path, this one line that goes up and to the right, as they say. The story is full of unexpected happenings and dots that make sense in retrospect, but would never have made sense as something to work towards, to aim for. And if you are more experimentally inclined, I'm sure you can think of examples of this where something became really important to you and to your story quite unexpectedly and very unpredictably. Maybe you can't imagine life without it now, but it was like unimaginable where it came from. Maybe it's a hobby or an idea or a life experience or a person. An experimental life is curated, collected, and experienced. The body of our life's work is something probably as interesting to explore looking back on it from the future as it is moving forwards within it. I also think this has a fundamentally different flavour from the concept that we are fed through hero's journey narratives, which are, ubiquitous in the Western world. And they are underpinned by a quest for a specific purpose, or like fulfilling a particular destiny, or whatever the language in the particular story is. Where the story is about this sort of fixed point in space or time where we've got to uncover this purpose to give shape to our reason for being. So even if we haven't yet conceptualized the goal, we don't yet know what the purpose is, our mission is to find out what that is supposed to be, and then to work towards it. Until then, just sort of muddling along, drifting, going, searching for what's my purpose? I need to find my purpose. We hear this language all the time. Maybe it's calling, finding your calling or your vocation. And actually the experimental approach is fundamentally different from this. And I know many experimental people who just find that sort of language really disempowering, really like, I don't have a purpose. And I don't think I want one. But yeah, we're often encouraged to think in those terms. And so rather than trying to figure out the purpose or the secret or the thing we're, on earth to do or whatever, our sense of purpose is found in the way that we hold or approach or explore the world within and around us. Purpose is values-based rather than vision-based. It's a connection to how we are rather than what we are or what we do. So thinking back to this last week and the rabbit hole that I fell down with the Mel Robbins video, it might have looked like a distraction, and I would have conceptualized it as a distraction had I not been sort of a little bit more aware of what's going on beneath the surface here. It wasn't a video I had any intention of making. I didn't plan to even think about this topic until I came across it in that Threads post. And on one level, it seemed completely irrelevant and a waste of my time. But there was something in the story that struck deep in me. It bothered me. And as I dug into it, I sort of began to find that connection to what it was that was moving inside me. And it was that values-based nudge, that intuitive sense of, I think I might need to do something with this. So I think I want to contribute something to the story. Values like collaboration, a desire to see integrity, honesty, people with power being held to account for abusing that power, giving voice to those who are overlooked or ignored, and whose creative voice is usurped by those who have bigger platforms and things like that. It was a story that really struck right at the heart of what I think of when I consider the difference between living life as a gentle rebel and conforming to business as usual, or just sort of complying with the status quo, when that leads to injustice and really unfair outcomes that don't reflect the work that has gone on within a situation. This sort of distinction between the world that I would love to see, where people are treated with respect, compassion, decency, and a world that's built on deception, greed, and opportunism. These were all sort of things that were alive in me as I was like, this is affecting me. As I'm exploring this story, there's something going on here, and I want to see what it might, kind of evoke in me and what I might produce as a result of it. So it's a piece in the puzzle of who I am that makes a lot more sense to look at now that that piece is in the picture. But it definitely felt quite confusing and weird as a concept ahead of time. It's like, does that piece fit anywhere here? Like, this doesn't make sense. This is not the kind of thing that I do or the kind of topic that I normally speak about. But actually, as I sit here now on the other side of it, I'm like, yeah, of course, that makes complete sense. Of course I did that. Of course I was going to do that. So yeah, we might think of experimental types as values rather than outcome driven by the stuff within, these intuitive nudges, these curiosities that might take us away from preconceived goals. It might be that, yeah, no, that's not who you are. That's not what you do. But it's, yeah, no, this is how I do. This is how I am. And so let's see what happens. Let's see what I create as a result of moving with this hunch, with this intuitive nudge. And this is not to say that experimental types don't have outcomes and goals. Of course, we all have those. We all need them to kind of structure and scaffold life. But if we have the means and the conditions to do so, I think we're probably going to be more open to a change of direction if something catches the sleeve of our attention in this way. You know, I was fortunate to be in a position where I could follow this nudge. And so, yeah, we wouldn't have a problem letting go of a goal if it means moving towards something that is inwardly compelling. It does have that sense of intrinsic reward to it. And so for many people that I know who lean in this experimental direction, the guilt that they feel for not hitting goals or not sticking to the goals that they set out to achieve isn't an internal thing. It's not a sense of like, I really want to hit that goal. Actually, the guilt that they feel comes from passing judgment through the lens of other people. So sort of seeing themselves through the eyes of others and saying, you know, I really should keep doing this because otherwise I'll look flaky. People keep saying, you know, stick to one thing. And so I really need to keep doing this. And that is not coming from within those people. That's coming from, just a desire to appease those who are looking on and maybe worrying, maybe with genuine concern, like, yeah, what are you doing? You're all over the place. Maybe these things kind of resonate with your experience of life. Or maybe you can think of someone, maybe you take a more conceptual approach, but you know someone who seems to be all over the place. I made a little list of potential distinctions between experimental and conceptual approaches, some of the things we might notice. And I wanted to consider those things that might give rise to a story of unbelonging for an experimental type. So things that might make you feel like there's something missing or something wrong with you if this is your kind of natural preference. But also take these with a pinch of salt. They're just things I've observed in myself, things I've talked to others about, and things I've seen other people experience as well. They may or may not feel relevant. So the first one is the pressure to figure out where you're going before you start versus getting started and seeing where it might take you. And so for a conceptual person, actually it's really important to figure out where you're going so that you can then like build the dots back and work out, okay, these are the steps I'm going to need to take to get there. Whereas for an experimental person, actually, you might need to just get started and see where it takes you. Secondly, actively figuring out, explaining, understanding things in order to put them into categories and boxes versus noticing, observing, and perceiving without judgment, integrating, combining and connecting dots that don't traditionally belong together. The experimental approach kind of might take something from a box over here and take something from a box over there, smush them together, as Emily Wapnick from Putty Like says, talking about sort of multi-potentialism. You know, this, again, I think a lot of experimental people recognize this multi-potentialite label where you're you have a whole load of different creative interests and projects that you want to explore, but smushing them together, bringing things that don't necessarily belong together in our minds, and making them work somehow. Thirdly, working out what I want to do with my life, refining it to a specific role that I will actively pursue no matter what, versus deciding how I want to approach life. So identifying the values and the guiding principles that will help me filter opportunities and invitations when they arise. 4, judge a situation based on how things appear, what I ought to think about this, versus judging a situation based on how things feel. So if you're thinking about success, how it appears on the surface gives you an anchor of how to feel about it. So a conceptual person might be like, yes, we won, therefore it's successful. I feel successful. Whereas an experimental person might actually experience a sort of objective failure, but it feel like a success because of how they approached it, and because of what came out of something. And 5, purpose as a concrete, tangible concept versus purpose as a sense of connection to the endeavor or the environment or the people or the project that I am with right now. So again, this is what we sort of talked about in relation to that hero's journey narrative around purpose. And then the final one, quantitative versus qualitative measures for the success of something. So the allure of objectively measurable success, which is the sort of conceptual thing, first place, a published book, a particular job role or whatever, versus the pleasure in the feeling of how you do something or what you're finding, the little nuggets that you experience along the way or uncover along the way, creative flow, the joy of uncertainty and adventure, where you carry the feeling rather than the eventual outcome as a measure of value. And so, I just want to finish up with a little thought on maps versus timelines. I mentioned the Return to Serenity Island course earlier. It's what I put together as a way to reimagine goals through an experimental approach to life, giving this alternative to the traditional conceptual goal setting models that we're so used to. The whole thing even felt like an example of my experimental self taking the reins and developing the project. It ended up with all sorts of elements that I was really not expecting to be there, and I certainly wouldn't have conceptualized at the outset when I first began working on it. It's why it ended up with these narrative soundscapes that tell a story through the 6 modules, the 6 chapters of the course. And so we're starting our spring voyage back to Serenity Island now. We've got a whole bunch of live Zoom picnic sessions in the calendar. We also have a WhatsApp group that started in the autumn when I opened it up in the autumn. After our picnic sessions earlier this year, there's kind of an appetite for keeping in touch, and during the time where we would meet, just to give people an opportunity to check in. So, doors will close at the end of February for this particular part of the year. So make sure you sign up before then if you're interested. I'd love to welcome you in. Just visit serenityisland.me for more information about how to join us, about the course itself. Of course, give me a shout if you've got any questions. I'll happily answer them. And I'm going to play this episode out with the abridged, shortened version of the first soundscape. So this is a soundscape from the first chapter of the course, first of 6. And yes, as I say, if you like this, then there's a whole bunch of them, which take you into and around Serenity Island. It's designed to kind of bring this to life for you. It's not a prescriptive course. It's designed to basically help you bring your creativity and play to life from within you. And it will help you find some calm, some clarity, some encouragement, inspiration to make things work for who and how you are, not who you've been told you ought to be or what you've been told you ought to do. So, yes, let me know if you've got any questions, and I'd love to see you on Serenity Island. I'll be back again soon with another episode of the Gentle Rebel podcast. Until then, do remember that you are an artist. The world needs your art. Now go and make somebody's day. Bye-bye. The last thing you remember, you were falling. You couldn't see anything when the fog descended. The light from your torch was unable to locate the path in front of you. It blinded your vision as it rebounded back off the opaque wall in front of you. And then you heard a great cracking sound, a rupture, an unravelling. You take a deep breath and prepare for the descent. As you tentatively open your eyes, you look around to see that you're in a wooden boat. You notice the strong and peaceful glow of twin lighthouses at the end of two piers in front of you. They look like welcoming arms, beckoning you in, as a strong current pulls the boat towards the harbour. You pass between the lighthouses, and as you do so, you see a sign. It says, "Welcome home." The boat bobs into the harbour and bounces gently off the wharf, where a familiar stranger is waiting. The harbour master has a grin from ear to ear. He tells you he's been expecting you. You throw him the rope and he moors the boat to the land. He reaches out his hand, repeats your name, and says once again, "Welcome home." As you step up onto the path, a deep feeling of familiarity sweeps over you. Where am I? You ask. Serenity Island. And you whisper to yourself, maybe I am home.